snow fell like ash over Chicago's financial district, covering the marble steps of Hale Tower in a thin, glittering frost. The city was slowing to a crawl, but inside the tower deals were still being made, lives measured in numbers and signatures. Michael Hale, CEO, strategist, perfectionist, had just finished his last meeting when a sound stopped him cold. It wasn't the hum of the streetlights or the echo of traffic. It was a whisper. A small, trembling voice that said, "Please, don't make me go back. If you were walking past, you might have missed it." But Michael turned, and in that instant, the life of a man who believed only in logic and balance sheets began to unravel. Tell me, what would you have done if you'd found her first? Because what happens next will make you question what kind of world we're really living in, and who's protecting the children we never see. She was no older than 7. Her hair hung in damp strands against her cheeks, her sweater torn her feet bare and pink from the cold. She sat huddled between the steps and a trash bin as if trying to disappear. When Michael crouched down, she flinched, then froze. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "You're safe now." But the little girl didn't look convinced. Her lips quivered as she whispered again. "They locked the fridge. I had to eat toothpaste." For a man who'd spent decades negotiating mergers worth billions, Michael had no words. His assistant Lydia Brooks hurried out behind him, phone in hand. "Sir, we should call security," she whispered. "This could be—" "Don't," Michael interrupted. His tone was quiet but final. "Get my coat. Now." He wrapped the wool around the girl's shoulders. She didn't resist, but her eyes darted to the glass doors behind them, terrified. "They'll find me," she said. "If they see me here, they'll finish what they started." Those words hit harder than any lawsuit, any market crash. Something inside Michael, a part long buried since the night his daughter Lily's car seat had been found empty on a dark highway, snapped awake. He lifted the girl carefully, her body light as snow. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Reed." He carried her through the revolving doors, past marble floors that gleamed under fluorescent light, while employees stopped and stared. This was a man known for keeping emotions off the record, for running a company where compassion wasn't part of the profit plan. But that night, none of it mattered. The child's shivering hands pressed against his chest, and all he could think was that he was holding someone else's unfinished story. In the elevator, Lydia spoke quietly. "Sir, you realize what this looks like. Cameras, the board, the press." Michael cut her off again. "Then let them see," he said. "For once, they can watch something that matters." When they reached the garage, the driver stared wide-eyed as Michael placed the girl in the back seat, still wrapped in his coat. "Northwestern Memorial," he ordered. His voice shook slightly, not from fear, but from something heavier, rage mixed with disbelief. The car sped through the snow headlights, slicing through the white blur. Emma's head rested against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "You're not supposed to help me," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Why not?" Michael asked. "They said people don't care." Not really. For the first time in years, Michael didn't have a prepared response. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. Then they were wrong. At the hospital entrance, the automatic doors hissed open, releasing a blast of antiseptic air. Nurses rushed forward as Michael lifted Emma out of the car. One nurse gasped when she saw the bruises circling the girl's wrists. "Sir, we have to report this to CPS immediately," she said. "Do it?" Michael replied, "but she's not leaving this hospital tonight." His tone left no room for argument. As they wheeled Emma away, her small hand reached for his. "Don't leave," she said softly. "They don't believe me." He bent close. "I believe you," he whispered back. When the elevator doors closed on the pediatric floor, Michael stood alone for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the polished metal. The face that looked back wasn't the man he'd been at sunrise. He saw fear there, fear of what he didn't know yet, of what those words might uncover. But he also saw something he hadn't seen in years, purpose. Outside, Chicago kept snowing, indifferent and endless. In a city built on noise, one whisper had broken through. And as Michael stepped into the waiting room, he realized this wasn't a rescue. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Somewhere beyond those sterile walls, someone had locked away a little girl and thought no one would care. Tonight, that illusion shattered, because one man had listened, and for anyone watching it begged a question that would haunt every part of what came next. When a whisper finds you, do you walk away or do you let it change everything? The emergency room smelled like bleach and adrenaline. Nurses moved fast, speaking in short bursts, while the snow on Michael Hale's coat melted into small puddles on the tile. Emma sat on the gurney, wrapped in a hospital blanket, her eyes half open, blinking under the harsh fluorescent light. For the first time since he'd found her, Michael wasn't sure what to do. He'd built empires by making decisions. Now he stood still, watching a 7-year-old whose life had been reduced to whispers and bruises. Dr. Renee Carter walked in her tone, calm but direct. She'd seen everything from car wrecks to overdoses, but this child made her pause. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, scanning the chart. "We're running full tests. Blood work, x-rays, trauma assessment. Do you know who brought her in?" "Last?" Michael shook his head. "No one. She was outside my building." "That's not an accident," Carter murmured. "Someone wanted her found, or didn't care if she was." Behind the glass partition, Lydia Brooks paced. "Sir, the press is already calling," she said under her breath. "Someone from the board saw you bring her in. They're asking what's going on." "Tell them I'm busy being human," Michael said. It came out harsher than he meant, but he didn't take it back. 2 hours passed. Emma was stable resting. Dr. Carter came out holding a clipboard that looked too heavy for what it contained. "She's malnourished, multiple healed fractures. And she's terrified of closed doors," she said quietly. "We have to report this to Child Protective Services within the hour. It's the law." Michael nodded, though the words tightened something in his chest. "And then? What happens?" "They'll send a social worker. She'll be placed in temporary custody while they investigate." "She just ran from one of those houses," he said. "You're telling me you'll send her back into the same system?" Carter's eyes met his. "I'm telling you, I don't have a choice." The automatic doors slid open again. A woman in a government-issued coat entered, her badge glinting under the lights. "I'm with CPS," she said briskly. "We got the report. Where's the child?" Michael stepped forward before anyone could answer. "You're not taking her tonight." "Sir, you can't interfere with the state case." "I'm not interfering," he said evenly. "I'm protecting her until you figure out why your office let this happen." The room froze. Even the nurse stopped typing. The social worker frowned. "We can handle this the proper way, Mr. Hale. I understand your concern." "No," he interrupted. "You don't. You understand paperwork. I understand what fear looks like when a child stops believing anyone will help her." The standoff broke only when Dr. Carter stepped between them. "Let's give her the night," she said gently. "She's sedated, she's safe here. We can review placement in the morning." The social worker hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Fine. But this goes in the report," Good Michael replied. "Make sure you spell my name right." Hours later, the hospital quieted. Machines hummed softly. Michael sat by Emma's bed, the monitors casting pale blue light across her face. For a moment, he forgot about the shareholders' deadlines, the image of success he'd spent years polishing. All that mattered was the small hand resting on the blanket, the faint rise and fall of her chest. Dr. Carter came in again, this time without her clipboard. "You did the right thing," she said. "I don't even know what that means anymore," he admitted. "It means you listened," she said simply. "Most people don't." Before she left, she handed him a printed email. This came through the hospital's secure tip line. It's flagged as anonymous. Michael unfolded it. The message was short, typed in a plain font. "If the girl's name is Emma Reed, check her foster file. Case marked resolved before inspection." Someone higher up signed it. He read it twice, then looked at Dr. Carter. "Is this real?" "Could be a prank," she said. "Could be someone inside the system trying to talk without losing their job." Michael folded the paper, slipping it into his pocket. "Either way, I'll find out." Outside, the first light of dawn began to break through the hospital windows, staining the snow a pale pink. Lydia walked in holding 2 coffees. "You've been up all night," she said quietly. "You don't owe anyone this, Michael." He took the cup but didn't drink. "Yes, I do," he said. "I owe her the truth." As he looked through the glass at Emma, sleeping beneath the warm light, he felt the weight of the world tilt. Somewhere in a government office, a child's name had been erased with the stroke of a pen. Somewhere, someone decided she didn't matter. But in this sterile room surrounded by machines and silence, Michael made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't walking away. In the reflection of the hospital window, his own face stared back. Older, more fragile, but alive in a way it hadn't been for years. The system had rules. He had resources. And between them stood a little girl who'd survived on whispers. He didn't know how far this would go, only that he couldn't stop now. Outside, Chicago began to stir. Ambulances wailed in the distance, the city grinding back to life. Michael stood adjusting his coat and whispered to himself, "If the system forgot her, then I'll make sure the system remembers." By the third morning, the snow had turned to gray slush on Michigan Avenue, and Michael Hale's world no longer ran on schedules or spreadsheets, it ran on questions. Emma was stable, staying in a private room, under a quiet arrangement between him and Dr. Renee Carter. CPS had backed off temporarily, but Michael knew it wouldn't last. That anonymous email haunted him. Case marked resolved before inspection. Someone had erased a file to protect someone else. He wasn't built to walk away from numbers that didn't add up. He needed help. Not the kind that worked in boardrooms, but someone who understood the darker corners of bureaucracy. That afternoon, he called Jacob Hart, a former FBI investigator turned private consultant. They'd met years ago at a corporate security conference back when Michael still believed every problem had a clean solution. Jacob's voice was rough, the sound of a man who'd seen too many lies. "It's not unusual," he said after reading the forwarded email. "When there's money tied to placement quotas, kids disappear in paperwork. Find out who signed off on Emma Reed's case," Michael said. "Whatever it costs." Within days, Jacob had a folder thick with data and suspicion. He spread it across Michael's dining table, printouts, scanned forms, and photographs marked with sticky notes. Here's the original intake. Emma was placed under the Safe Future Foundation, a private foster network with state contracts. On paper, they look legitimate, but follow the donations and it gets ugly. He tapped a page with a pen. This charity's connected to 3 shell nonprofits, all with matching board members. Same lawyer, same address, different names. Michael leaned forward. "Who runs it?" Jacob flipped to the last page. A name jumped out, Mark Hale. Michael blinked. "What? Different Hale?" Jacob said quickly. "No relation, at least not legally. former contractor for the Department of Human Services. He's been involved in half a dozen placement reviews that were mysteriously closed early. Where is he now, South Side? Rents a property registered to one of the Foundation's holding companies. It's quiet off the radar. They sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. The air felt heavier now, charged with something that had nothing to do with business. "You think he's the one Emma's afraid of?" Michael asked. Jacob nodded slowly. She mentioned the silver bracelet. "Right? Look here." He pulled up a traffic camera still. In grainy footage from 2 months earlier, a man in a dark parka walked out of a social services office, a small girl trailing behind. His wrist flashed a wide silver band. Michael stared at the image until it blurred. "How do we prove it?" "We don't yet. But I know how to make him nervous." That night, Jacob and Michael drove south through blocks of shuttered storefronts and flickering streetlights. The address led to a narrow duplex wedged between 2 abandoned houses. Jacob killed the headlights. "No alarms," he murmured. "But the basement windows are boarded from the outside. That's not normal." Michael's chest tightened. "We can't just break in." Jacob gave a half smile. "I didn't say we would, but if the door's open..." He pushed it gently. It creaked, but didn't lock. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and bleach. A single lamp glowed in the living room beside a cracked leather chair. The floorboards moaned as they stepped deeper. On the coffee table sat a children's hair clip, pink with a tiny star. In the hallway, Jacob motioned for silence. From behind a door came a faint hum, electrical constant. They pushed it open and froze. The basement stairs led to a space lined with soundproof foam, and a small camera mounted to the wall. On a folding table, a voice recorder blinked red. Jacob hit play. A child's voice whispered, "Day 7. He says, I'm his project." Michael's stomach twisted. He reached for the file label on the nearby box. "Read E. Call it in," Jacob said quietly. But before he could, a sound upstairs made them both look up footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Jacob signaled for Michael to move back toward the kitchen, but the door swung open before they reached it. A tall man stepped inside, his eyes sharp, his wrist catching the light. The silver bracelet gleamed. "Well?" he said with a calmness that felt wrong. "Guess I should have changed the locks." Jacob's training kicked in. Mark Hale, the man smirked. "Depends who's asking." His gaze shifted to Michael, studying him. "You're the businessman on TV, aren't you? The hero with the lost kid? Where is she?" Michael demanded. Mark shrugged. "Which one? They all run. Eventually they come back." The tension snapped like glass. Jacob moved first, grabbing Mark by the arm, but the man swung back hard, sending them crashing against the wall. Michael dove for the phone, dialing 911, his voice shaking but clear. "This is Michael Hale. South Langley Avenue, duplex number 48. We found a room soundproofed children's recordings. Send police now." By the time sirens wailed in the distance, Mark was gone, the back door swinging open into the freezing night. Officers flooded the scene minutes later, sealing off the house. A detective introduced herself, Laura, Miles Chicago PD's Special Victims Unit. She listened without interrupting as Jacob explained what they'd found. When he mentioned the recordings, she nodded grimly. "You just walked into something bigger than you think. That foundation's been on our radar, but every lead dies before it reaches court. Someone's protecting it." Michael handed her the SD card they'd found taped under the desk. Then this might keep it alive. Later, standing outside under the flickering streetlight, Michael stared at the squad cars pulling away. Snow began falling again, silent and relentless. He had a file on her, he said quietly, and others. Jacob zipped his jacket. 47, if those labels mean what I think they do. Michael's jaw clenched. Then, 47 families deserve the truth. Back in his car, he opened the SD card on his laptop. The folders were labeled by initials and dates, each one containing voice clips, progress notes, and financial spreadsheets routed through the Safe Future Foundation. The final folder was named Pack Lead, Active. Inside a spreadsheet listed children's names next to payment transfers marked as closed cases. It wasn't negligence, it was business. Michael stared at the data until the screen blurred. Every number, every transaction told a story someone tried to bury. He saved the files twice, uploaded them to an encrypted drive, and closed the laptop. For years, he'd measured success by profits, but tonight he measured it in lives stolen and voices silenced. As the city lights flickered across the windshield, Jacob glanced over. "You know this doesn't end quietly." "Right." Michael nodded. "Good. Maybe it's time someone made noise." He looked back once more at the house behind the police tape. Somewhere in there, a child's whisper had been recorded and filed like evidence that no one intended to see. Now it would be heard. Because for the first time in a long time, Michael Hale wasn't thinking about saving a company. He was thinking about saving what was left of a country's conscience. The morning the story broke, Chicago didn't wake up to business as usual. News anchors interrupted broadcasts with a single photograph Michael Hale carrying a small girl wrapped in his coat through a storm of flashing lights outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The headline read, "Billionaire CEO intervenes in foster scandal." Within hours, the internet exploded. Some called him a hero. Others called it a publicity stunt. But behind the cameras, a war was brewing, one between truth and the machine built to bury it. Detective Laura Miles arrived at Michael's office that afternoon, carrying a stack of new warrants and a grim expression. "We've got connections now. Financial, political, all circling back to Safe Future Foundation," she said. "But the second we move, the people funding this will try to paint you as unstable. You've poked a bear that's lived in the dark for decades." Michael stood by the window overlooking the city. "Then let them come. We'll fight in the light." Jacob Hart spread a map across the conference table. "They've got layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and political donations. We can trace the money, but you'll have to decide how public you want to go. Once this hits, there's no retreat." Michael didn't hesitate. "We go public. All of it. The files, the recordings, the payments, they've hidden behind paperwork for too long." Lydia Brooks, always the pragmatist, looked uneasy. "Sir, this could destroy your company. The board's already panicking. They want you to issue a statement saying this was a personal humanitarian act, something separate from Holdings." Michael turned to her eyes sharp. "It was personal, but it's not separate. If we don't stand for something beyond profit, then what are we even running?" By nightfall, Michael and Jacob stood in a quiet TV studio. The local station had agreed to air an exclusive segment. Behind them, screens flickered with data charts, names, and financial trails linking state officials, private contractors, and the foster network that had failed Emma. The anchor began the interview with the question everyone was asking: why risk everything for a child who isn't yours? Michael didn't blink. Because she could have been anyone's. And the system that broke her is the same one we all pretend doesn't exist until it's too late. His voice, steady and restrained, carried something deeper than outrage. It carried conviction. When the segment aired, millions watched. Hashtags erupted. Her the whisper, Rashash justice. For Emma, her safe future exposed. Protesters gathered outside the CPS headquarters holding candles and signs. Churches, schools, and community groups organized donation drives for abused children. Yet the more light Michael shone, the darker the resistance became. 2 days later, a state senator accused him of grandstanding. His corporate accounts were audited. Anonymous threats flooded his phone. One email read simply, "You don't win against ghosts." Detective Miles called him in. "They're scared," she said, "which means you're getting close. But they've got judges, lobbyists, and PR firms on their side. We need something irrefutable, something that makes silence impossible." Michael nodded. "The recordings." Jacob looked up. "You mean release them publicly?" "Yes. Not all, just one. The one where Emma's voice breaks. The clip went live on a Friday evening. It wasn't graphic, just haunting." "Day 7, Emma whispered. "He says I'm his project." The internet froze. There was no turning away from that sound, no spinning it into politics. Donations to children's advocacy groups surged overnight. The governor's office called an emergency press briefing. And in a small hospital room, Emma sat beside Dr. Carter, watching the news, holding Copper, the therapy dog Michael had brought her close against her chest. For the first time, she smiled. "They heard me," she said softly. But the fight wasn't over. That weekend, Jacob burst into Michael's penthouse, laptop in hand. "Mark Hale's been spotted in Indiana," he said. "Local PD has him under surveillance, but he's not running anymore. He's waiting." Michael's jaw set. "Then, let's make sure the law doesn't forget him this time." They coordinated with Detective Miles, who arranged the warrant. By dawn, Mark Hale was in custody, his expression calm, almost amused. When reporters shouted questions, he smirked. "You think this ends with me?" he said before being pushed into the police car. In the following days, hearings began. The courtroom overflowed with media activists and silent survivors who finally saw themselves reflected in the headlines. Lawyers argued, officials denied, but evidence spoke louder than any spin. The recordings, financial transfers, and testimony from former employees painted a picture so detailed no one could hide behind bureaucracy again. Michael sat behind the witness stand, hands clasped, his voice steady. "I'm not here as a businessman," he told the court. "I'm here as a citizen who saw what happens when we stop listening." Emma's voice shouldn't have had to travel through trauma to be heard. When the verdict came, the judge's gavel struck like thunder. Multiple arrests were ordered, foundation executives, government liaisons, even 2 CPS supervisors. The state launched a full inquiry into foster oversight. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted not with cheers, but tears, relief mixed with disbelief that justice had finally reached the unreachable. That night, back at the hospital, Michael found Emma in the art therapy room coloring a house with tall sunflowers. She looked up as he entered. "Are we safe now?" she asked. He knelt beside her. "Safer," he said. "And we're not stopping until every kid like you can say the same." Dr. Carter entered quietly, holding a folder. "The state wants to place her with a guardian until the system stabilizes," she said gently. "You have the right to apply." Michael's throat tightened. "I already did." Weeks later, the court granted him temporary guardianship. News outlets replayed footage of him walking out of the courthouse hand in hand with Emma Copper trotting alongside them. But beyond the cameras, real work had begun. Lawyers formed coalitions. Politicians drafted reform bills. Survivor networks grew louder, united under one name, the Whisper Initiative, founded by Michael and funded through his own company's trust. Its mission to ensure no child disappeared into paperwork again. In private, Michael returned often to the basement recording from that night. He didn't play it for pain, but for purpose, a reminder of how close the world came to forgetting. He'd lost faith in many things over his career, but not in this. That one voice, no matter how small, could still start a revolution. Late one evening, as Chicago lights shimmered across the skyline, Lydia joined him on the balcony. "You realize you've changed the law, right?" she said with a tired smile. He shook his head. "No, Emma did. I just happened to be there when she whispered." Below in the city that once turned a blind eye, candles flickered outside CPS headquarters again, this time in hope not morning. And somewhere upstairs a little girl slept soundly, dreaming not of closets or chains, but of open fields and sunlight. The fight for justice hadn't ended. It had only begun, but for the first time it had a name, a face, and a voice the world would never silence again. Spring arrived quietly that year, the kind of season that crept into Chicago after months of gray skies and courtroom headlines. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael Hale wasn't watching stock indexes or television cameras. He was watching sunlight spill through the wide front windows of a modest two-story home on the edge of Lincoln Park. A home with cream-painted shutters, a small picket fence, and a garden where Emma had insisted on planting sunflowers. She was kneeling in the soil now. Copper sprawled lazily beside her, his nose dusted with dirt. "They'll grow taller than me," she said, her voice bright with the kind of hope that once seemed impossible. "They'll grow taller than both of us," Michael replied, setting down a watering can. She grinned. "Then we'll have to keep up." It had been 6 months since the verdict, 6 months since the Foundation's network collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The Whisper Initiative had expanded into a national movement. Michael's days were no longer about mergers. They were about meetings with child advocacy groups, court reform committees, and trauma-informed counselors. He'd stepped down from his CEO title, but not his purpose. The man who once built skyscrapers now built safety nets. Inside the house, photographs lined the mantel. Some showed Emma at the hospital's art program, others captured her at community rallies surrounded by smiling faces. In one, she stood beside Governor Ellis at the signing of the Child Protection Reform Act legislation born from her story. The photo that meant the most, though, wasn't public. It sat in a simple wooden frame on Michael's desk, Emma in a yellow dress holding a drawing of a home under a sun-covered sky. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Me and Mr. H. are safe place." But healing didn't happen overnight. There were still nights when Emma woke up trembling, the memories too vivid, the dark too close. On those nights, Michael would sit by her bedside, reading from the same worn book he used to read to his daughter Lily before the accident. He never forced Emma to talk. He just stayed until her breathing slowed. Slowly, the silence that used to haunt their nights became something gentler, something alive with trust. Dr. Renee Carter still visited every few weeks both as friend and physician. During one of her visits, she watched Emma chasing Copper across the yard and turned to Michael. "She's not just surviving," she said softly. "She's living again. You gave her that." Michael shook his head. "She gave me a reason to remember what matters." Word about the Whisper Initiative had spread far beyond Illinois. Branches opened in Seattle, Austin, and Boston. Each center offered legal aid for children, counseling, and emergency housing for those trapped in unsafe placements. Survivors of the foster system began volunteering, some returning for the first time to face their pasts and transform it into something good. At the heart of every center was the same symbol Emma had drawn, the yellow house with sunflowers. It became a beacon, a promise that no voice would be lost again. That summer, Michael received an invitation to speak before Congress about systemic reform. The night before the hearing, he sat on the porch, the smell of freshly cut grass mixing with the faint sweetness of the sunflowers beginning to bloom. Emma curled beside him with a mug of cocoa. "Are you nervous?" she asked. He smiled. "A little." "What will you tell them that one voice can change everything?" he said, "even if it starts as a whisper." Emma tilted her head. "Do you think they'll listen?" He looked out at the garden, glowing under the porch light. "They will. because they'll see you." The next morning, the hearing room was packed. Cameras flashed as Michael took his seat at the witness table. He didn't bring lawyers or advisors, just Emma and Dr. Carter sitting quietly in the front row. When the chairwoman asked him to begin, his voice was calm but certain. "For too long, we've measured progress by statistics," he said. "But every missing report, every silenced child, every erased file represents a life, a human story. Emma Reed is not a number. She's proof that the system can break and still be rebuilt." He paused, his gaze finding Emma's. "We owe our children more than shelter. We owe them safety, dignity, and belief. The day I found her, she said, no one would believe the garbage kids. That's the phrase she used. I promised her the world would." The room fell silent. By the end of his testimony, even the hardest-faced senators had softened. What began as one case became the foundation for federal reform, tighter oversight, transparent foster contracts, and a public child protection database nicknamed Emma's Watch. Months later, on the first anniversary of the verdict, the community held a celebration at the Lincoln Park House. Neighbors, advocates, teachers, and volunteers filled the yard. There were banners reading, "One whisper can change the world." Emma, now 8, stood on a small wooden stool and gave a short speech of her own. "A long time ago I thought I was invisible," she said, her voice carrying through the crowd. "But someone saw me and then everyone did. Now I want to see others. Because no kid should have to scream to be heard." Applause broke like thunder. Michael, standing off to the side, felt something shift deep inside him, a peace he hadn't known since before Lily's accident. It wasn't closure, it was transformation. The grief that had once paralyzed him had become something sacred, a bridge between what was lost and what was saved. As the sun began to set, the garden glowed gold. Emma's sunflowers had grown tall, their faces turned toward the fading light. She ran through them, barefoot copper bounding behind her, laughter echoing across the yard. Michael followed her with a quiet smile. "They really did grow taller than us," she called out. He laughed. "Guess we'll just have to plant more." That night, after everyone left the house, was quiet again. Michael stood at the window, watching the garden sway in the evening breeze. Emma was asleep upstairs, clutching the same stuffed bear she'd had since the hospital. The world outside was still full of noise laws, politics, unfinished fights, but in this small corner of it there was peace. He stepped onto the porch and looked up at the stars. For a long moment he just breathed. The air smelled of soil cocoa and something new renewal. He whispered softly into the night, "We did it, kid." In the garden below, the wind rustled through the sunflowers as if answering back. Their tall stems swayed together, bending but never breaking. They were everything he'd hoped Emma would become: strong, bright, rooted in light. And for the first time since that frozen night in front of Hale Tower, Michael Hale believed the world could change one whisper, one child, one sunflower at a time. In the end, the whisper in the snow became more than a story about rescue. It became a story about rebirth. Michael Hale, a man once defined by power, success, and emotional distance, stumbled upon a broken child on a freezing night and discovered the one thing his wealth could never buy: purpose. What began as an impulsive act of compassion unfolded into a journey that redefined what it means to live with integrity. Through Emma Reed's frightened eyes, Michael saw the failures of a world that valued results over humanity. Through her courage, he remembered how to feel again. Emma, the girl who once whispered her pain to no one, grew into a voice that echoed across a nation. Her quiet bravery exposed a system built on silence and neglect, and her healing became proof that even the smallest light can pierce the darkest corners of injustice. What she lost in innocence, she gained in resilience, and what Michael lost in control, he found in love. Together, they turned grief into movement, fear into faith, and despair into hope. The Whisper Initiative, the Child Protection Reform Act, and the Yellow House with Sunflowers all stood as monuments to that transformation. But the true victory wasn't political, it was personal. The story ended not with headlines or applause, but with laughter spilling from a backyard where sunflowers stretched toward the sky. It ended with a child finally sleeping through the night, and a man rediscovering what it meant to belong. That's what healing looks like, not a grand finale, but the quiet persistence of love that refuses to fade. From this story, we are reminded that humanity's greatest power lies not in wealth or influence, but in empathy. In a world that often rewards indifference, compassion becomes an act of rebellion. It asks us to stop scrolling past suffering to notice the invisible, and to believe that one small act of kindness can alter the course of another person's life. Michael didn't set out to change the world, he simply refused to walk away, and that choice became a revolution. This lesson matters now more than ever. In our communities, there are still Emmas waiting to be seen, children, neighbors, co-workers, strangers whose whispers go unheard. And there are still Michaels among us, people who've lost themselves, chasing the wrong kind of success, who just need one moment of connection to find their way back to purpose. The world doesn't change in a single headline. It changes when ordinary people choose compassion over convenience, action over apathy, and love over fear. So, as this story closes, let it stay with you. Let it remind you that even in a world full of noise, one voice can still make a difference. Let it challenge you to listen more deeply, act more boldly, and live with the kind of kindness that echoes. And if stories like this touch your heart, if they remind you that empathy still matters, please subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating heartfelt, powerful stories that celebrate courage, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between hope and humanity. Together, let's make sure no whisper ever fades into silence again.